Iseth, what are you doing?
What are you doing?
It's been over 3 months since your last video.
3 months. Well, get back to work.
But I don't wanna.
Who do you think you are? Me? Get your ass to work and go debunk something.
Hypocrite.
Iseth, we need you. The internet needs you.
But I don't wanna.
Do you have any idea what YouTube recommendations are like? Can you even understand the type of shit that they expect me to watch?
Alright. I got it. Okay, fine. Make a video.
It sounds so commonsensical, doesn't it, to say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence if you were to believe them. That sounds so right.
Well, more than sounding right, it sounds intuitive. If your neighbors tell you they have a new cat, you might believe it without much questioning, because that is a very common occurrence. If, however, they tell you they got an albino Siberian tiger as a pet, you might raise an eyebrow or two and ask them to have a look at it. Having said that, intuition is not the same as factual evidence. So please, go ahead.
But in fact, I think it's demonstrably false. It is simply not true that highly improbable events require extraordinary evidence in order to believe in them.
Hold on there a second. You're getting a bit confused there, Craigie. You see, a claim is not an actual event. If your neighbor says that a volcano just erupted under his house, that is a claim. Seeing his house on fire and magma pouring out of his basement, that is an event. Or a hallucination. And before we go on, I feel like we should define extraordinary as well. Because there is a bit of a difference between the kind of extraordinary that makes you survive a plane crash and the kind of extraordinary that suddenly poofs unicorn spitting pixies into existence. One is very rare, but still in the realm of physically possible, depending on the circumstances. The other, not so much. However, I do agree with you to an extent. While it is a good idea to take extraordinary claims with a pinch of salt, or sometimes a whole barrel of salt, and fact-check them whenever possible, many people absorb extraordinary propositions like sponges, without questioning them whatsoever. And that seems to be a problem with people, regardless of their creeds or lack thereof. I mean, the only difference between humans not being apes and randomly made up Pokemon genders is that a different set of the population falls for it. There! Now it has a strike!
And probability theorists realized this. From the time of Condorcet through John Stuart Mill, probability theorists debated over what it would take to establish the reality of a highly improbable event. And they realized very quickly that if you require that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence, then we would be prevented from believing many ordinary but highly improbable events that happen all the time.
Craigie, if an event is ordinary, then it is by definition not extraordinary. And if an event happens all the time, then it's not really all that improbable.
For example, suppose you hear on the evening news an announcement of the pick in last night's lottery. Now that's an enormously improbable event, one chance out of millions, perhaps.
No, you winning the lottery is very improbable. Someone winning the lottery is not improbable at all. In fact, it is so common that a lot of people would get very suspicious if no one would win the lottery for a very prolonged period of time. These two probabilities are not the same and should not be treated the same.
And yet, you would never need to have extraordinary evidence that was more probable than that in order to believe in it rationally. So what probability theorists came to see is that you need to consider not only the intrinsic probability of the event, but you also need to determine the ratio between the probability of the evidence that we have, given that the event occurred, versus the probability of that evidence if the event did not occur.
Alright, let us translate this into something that a common Illuminati lizard can actually understand. The probability of an event simply tells you how likely something can occur. And that is usually a number between 0 or 0%, meaning it never happens, to 1 or 100%, meaning it happens every time. So far so good? Now, if you have a probability of something occurring, you also likewise have a probability of it not occurring. For example, if you toss a coin, let's say a toonie, if you toss a toonie, then you have a 50% chance to get a polar bear. However, you also have a 50% chance that Queen Elizabeth II smirks at you and reminds you that Canada is still a British colony that gladly kisses Her Majesty's feet and pays for her spoiled grandson's Mountie collection. Anyway, if you have a 50% chance to get the bear and a 50% chance not to get the bear, then your ratio is 1 to 1, meaning you are as likely to get the bear as not to get him. So far so good, Craigie? Where will you go from there?
And if that ratio weights in favor of saying the evidence is vastly more probable if the event occurred than if it did not, then that can serve to counterbalance any intrinsic improbability in the event itself.
The ratio weighs in favor of saying the evidence is more probable, or the ratio weighs in favor of the evidence being more probable? Because those are two different things. Also, what sort of evidence are we talking about here? If you have to take a stick and poke around some probability haystack to maybe or maybe not find your evidence, that's not very reliable evidence, is it? I don't know how you define evidence, and considering how much you like to abuse fancy words, I dread to ask you for your definition, but usually evidence is what we use to prove something, not the other way around. And if there is no evidence, then it doesn't really matter how likely you believe you can find evidence, it is still not there. And saying it is there won't make it any more there either. I will grant you the point that if something happens a lot, then we are more likely to figure it out and gather evidence for it. But that doesn't mean that you have to have something happening in order for us to have evidence for it. For example, we know a lot about the moon, space, gravity, vacuum, trajectories, and so on. With that knowledge, we can calculate and prove what happens to a golf ball if someone were to start golfing on the moon. And we can do so regardless of whether someone golfed on the moon or not. But I feel like I'm giving you too much credit here. Let me repeat your argument once more, just to let it melt like stinky hot wax right into our eardrums.
If that ratio weights in favor of saying the evidence is vastly more probable if the event occurred than if it did not, then that can serve to counterbalance any intrinsic improbability in the event itself.
If the ratio weighs in favor of saying that it's more likely than not to find evidence of unicorns spitting pixies, if at some point pixies were actually spitting unicorns, then that can serve to counterbalance the intrinsic probability of unicorns spitting pixies. Beautiful.
And so it's simply and demonstrably not the case that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence, and that's why we are able to rationally believe in many extraordinary events on the basis of evidence that is not itself highly extraordinary.
No, you have not demonstrated that extraordinary events don't require extraordinary evidence. And considering that you actually wanted to prove that extraordinary claims don't require extraordinary evidence, that in and of itself is already quite a failure. However, what you did demonstrate is that there are people who are very eager to believe extraordinary woo-woo without proper evidence or even a tinge of critical thinking for that matter. But as a smart philosopher once told me, if all your friends would jump off a cliff, and you wouldn't hear them land, did they even exist in the first place? That was surprisingly refreshing. Hey guys, how about a little competition? I'm bored, and probably some of you are too. How about you try to give me your best Craig impersonation and your best woo-woo whistling word mess in the comment section below? Oh, and if you're super bored, why don't you join me in Discord? Also hit the like button, subscribe, ring the bell, share the video, and stay healthy. Especially stay healthy. Have a great evening.
Alright, Iseth, listen here. Do you have any idea what it's like to be in the middle of the fucking Canadian wilderness? I don't think anybody can until they're trapped in this fucking town. What are you doing? There are people here. There's one person here who relies on you and your weird accent and your weird sex appeal that makes me feel like I'm kind of kinky just for watch. But I need that. Okay? That's what I need. Only you can save us from this.